Hello, my name is Matt Hayden. My background is in sales, marketing, management and leadership. And for the last 12 years, I've been an independent training consultant. I design and deliver training across all sectors and in a wide range of organizations. I train people in all types of communication skills, assertiveness, presentation skills, leadership, teamwork, and all of these fields really involve influence. I've also had a keen interest for most of my life in neuroscience and psychology. And so I'm absolutely fascinated in what makes people tick and how we can get along with each other better. So today I'm going to be talking to you about influencing different personalities. And really this rests upon two propositions. One, that people are different. We're all individual, unique personalities. And two, that we need and we'd like to influence people positively. But how often do we really think about the ways in which we differ from the people with whom we interact? And how often do we analyse how influential we are and how we can improve the key skill of communicating persuasively with people? Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is a reaction, both are transformed." And that reaction can be a positive one, or it can be a negative one, depending on how we interact with the people. He also said, if there is anything that we wish to change in the child, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could be better changed in ourselves. And I think the key to that really is that the only way in which we actually influence other people is by how we behave and interact with them ourselves. And of course, it doesn't just apply to children, it applies to all of us. So what actually do we mean by influence? The dictionary definition of influence is the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something. We often think about that term influence in relation to sales or being a leader. But I would argue that we'd all like to influence the people that we deal with at any level and in all sorts of environments. It might be our boss, it might be our colleagues, it might be our friends, our family, our parents, our children, our partners. And to be an influential person is going to make your life a lot easier and probably your relationships with other people better as well. In terms of leadership, the former president of the United States, President Eisenhower, said, "Leadership is the art of getting someone to do something you want done because they want to do it." And what he really meant by that was that if you really want to influence people, understanding what their motivations are, what their drivers are, what their values are, is a very good way of affecting their behaviour. The novelist George Eliot put it quite nicely when she said, "Blessed is the influence of one true loving soul on another." So I'm going to look at three topics today. The first of those is emotional intelligence. What does that mean? What does it look like? Then I'm going to look at a psychological model called the Big Five personality traits, which has a handy acronym to help us remember it. And then we're going to look at the 6 principles of influence, which come from the work of Professor Robert Cialdini. So let's start with emotional intelligence. It's a term that is in more common usage nowadays, and many of us will have heard it, but what does it actually mean? Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, said that it is the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, for managing emotions in ourselves and in our relationships. You may be familiar with the metaphor that people are like icebergs. What we know about icebergs is that the vast majority of them is hidden under the surface of the water. And that's pretty true of human beings, really. What we see on the surface from people is their behavior. It's the only thing, the only evidence that we have on which to judge people. But quite often what we do is make all sorts of assumptions based upon that behavior. And we do some guesswork, we do some mind reading, and we quite often infer motivations from people based upon their behavior, which actually may not be accurate at all. People's behavior is affected by lots of things under the surface: their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, their opinions. Might be some cultural influences on them, their values, biases, feelings. All of these things affect how we communicate and interact outwards with the world. So Daniel Goleman said that there are 5 aspects to emotional intelligence, and the first of those is self-awareness. People who are highly self-aware understand their own emotions and moods. They understand how they're feeling and the effect that maybe the environment or the people they're dealing with are having on them. The second of those aspects is self-regulation. We could be very aware of our moods, but how good are we about regulating our behavior and how we express our emotions outwardly? The third aspect is social skill. How good are we at interacting with other people? How well do we pick up on the cues and the clues they give us and responding appropriately to those? I might be having a conversation with someone where I think I'm being absolutely fascinating, but I don't actually pick up on the fact that they're glazing over a little bit. People with good social skill read other people pretty well and they respond appropriately. The fourth element of emotional intelligence that Goleman says is empathy. And again, empathy is a word that we hear a lot nowadays in our culture, but what does it actually mean? I'd say that empathy is the capacity to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, metaphorically. Can we understand where they're coming from? Do we understand the emotions they're feeling? Can we understand their point of view? It doesn't necessarily mean that we sympathize with them or agree with them, but the more that we can empathize with people, the more likely we are to be able to understand them and therefore have a productive communication with them. And the last aspect of emotional intelligence that Goleman talks about is motivation. People with good emotional intelligence understand their own motivations and their own drivers, and they use that understanding in order to be able to help themselves achieve goals, develop themselves, improve themselves, and work on these other 4 aspects of emotional intelligence. And I said work on because although it's probably pretty likely that there are some people who are more naturally inclined to have higher emotional intelligence than others, it is a skill that you can work on. If you want to assess yourself on emotional intelligence, there are lots of tests you can take online, questionnaires that will give you some sort of insight into where you score on these 5 factors. And in terms of self-awareness, which of course itself is one of these factors, the more we are aware of aspects of ourselves, the more able we are to work on them and improve them where they need to be improved. You can also take online tests, by the way, for this next topic that we're going to look at, the Big 5 personality traits. The Big 5 personality traits is a model for understanding certain aspects of human psychology. Its foundations really go all the way back to Greek philosophy, but it has been studied and researched in more detail in modern times by psychology. And psychology is not an exact science, but this particular theory seems to be quite robust and has survived many research tests over the years. So the Big 5 personality traits talks about 5 traits of human personality on which we all vary. We're all on a spectrum. And they are summarized by the acronym OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So I'm going to go through those one by one and tell you a little bit about them. And I'd encourage you to think about maybe yourself, other people you deal with, and how you might relate to people depending on where they lie on those spectra. The first one is openness. People who score high on openness are open to their emotions, open to new experiences and ideas, often quite keen on innovation and looking at different ways of approaching things. People who score low on openness might be more inflexible in their thinking, might be more rigid. And just to remind you, of course, these are a spectrum, and it's not binary. You don't have people who are open or not open. We all lie somewhere on a line here. And all of these positions can have some pluses and can have some negatives. So for example, if I'm very high in openness, that probably means that I'm keen on innovation. I might be adaptable to change, but it could also mean that I am perhaps not really very careful at considering the impact of making a change in something. Or I might be open to really new ideas that haven't been rigorously tested. If I'm low in openness, that could be seen as being stubborn and not open to new ideas, but it could also be being reliable, being solid. So all of these aspects, there's not a good or a bad necessarily, but they are aspects of our personality that will affect how we think, how we feel, and how we act in the world. The second of the big 5 personality traits is conscientiousness. People who are very high in conscientiousness will be the sort of people who will be seen as reliable, the sort of people who deliver projects on time and take great pride in their work. They might have quite tidy desks and be pretty organized. They'll be punctual, this sort of thing. They'll follow through on their promises. People who are lower in conscientiousness might be less likely to do those things. They might be good at starting jobs, but not very good at finishing them, etc. I guess people with higher conscientiousness might tend to be perceived as being more self-disciplined. But again, there can be some negatives. People with very high conscientiousness might be a bit inflexible. They might not be able to sometimes adapt to situations or be happy with the compromises that are sometimes needed to deliver tasks on time. The third aspect of the big 5 personality traits is extroversion. And this one is one that probably is spoken more about and we're more aware about in our society nowadays. People often talk about being an extrovert or being an introvert. But do we fully understand what that means? Often I've encountered people who think that introversion means shyness and extroversion means confidence, and that's not necessarily the case. I actually, as it happens, an extreme extrovert. When I last took the test, I got 98%. But that doesn't mean that I'm always confident. I'm quite often shy, quite often a little bit reticent when I'm meeting new people. A better way of understanding extroversion and introversion really is to look at it in 2 ways. First of all, where people get their energy from. Extroverts tend to get their energy from being around people. They enjoy being with people and they're energized by it. They quite often enjoy team meetings, social events, group activities, and that sort of thing. Introverts, it's not that they don't like people, but they actually get quite drained by being with people, and particularly in larger groups of people. And so therefore they need time on their own in order to recharge their batteries. I had a really good example of this recently with a friend of mine. We went away for a weekend to visit some friends. We spent the whole weekend with 3 or 4 other people. And in the car on the way home, my friend said to me, because we know each other quite well, she said, "You're probably pretty energized now, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am. And when I get home, I'm actually going to find it quite flat. I'm going to be on my own. I'm not going to be around people. I'm going to find that a bit of a struggle." My friend, who's the complete opposite and quite an extreme introvert, said that she'd enjoyed the weekend, but found it quite draining and was really looking forward to being on her own for a few days in a quieter environment. The other thing that is often said about introverts and extroverts is that extroverts speak to think and introverts think to speak. What that means is that we extroverts tend to talk quite readily, and quite often we're just expressing our thoughts and feelings straight out, directly out from our brain. That can have its upsides. It means that people find us quite open often and know exactly what we're thinking and feeling, or at least how we're expressing it. But of course, that can also have its downsides. It can mean that maybe we can be a bit overwhelming. Quite often we're talking when we perhaps should be listening. It can also mean that sometimes we don't consider the impact of what we're saying. If we think about going back to emotional intelligence in terms of self-regulation, self-regulation is something that extroverts quite often struggle with. Introverts, on the other hand, like to think about what they're going to say. And they quite often need a little bit of time to process decisions, consider ideas. So if you think about how it relates to you in your real world, maybe you're in a team meeting, maybe you're working with a team on a daily basis, you'll almost certainly have a mix of these personality types. Some people will be more introverted than others. Some people will be more extroverted than others. I think it's really interesting that over the period of the pandemic, when many of us have worked at home, either on our own or maybe just with our family, that's actually suited some introverts better. They haven't had to get onto packed trains to go to work. They haven't had to work in open plan offices. They haven't had to deal in raucous, busy team meetings. Those of us who are extroverts have perhaps found this time more difficult than others because we've been withdrawn from the social interaction that gives us energy. So just in terms of how you work with people and how you lead people sometimes, thinking and understanding people's preferences in terms of extroversion and introversion is pretty key. And as with most of these things, getting to know people is going to be the key as to whether you have worthwhile relationships with them. Asking them questions about how they like to work, where they like to work, how they like to be communicated with, how they like to form decisions. All of those things will help you have a more positively influential relationship with people. Let's look at the fourth of the big 5 personality traits, and that's agreeableness. People who are higher on agreeableness tend to be the sort of people who value harmony with the people they interact with. They like to have agreement. They like to perhaps not rock the boat. That can be great in terms of having friendly, cohesive, harmonious relationships with people, but it can make it quite difficult with people who've got high agreeableness to perhaps express a difference of opinion, challenge a point of view, deal with conflict. People who are low in agreeableness, it's the reverse. They tend to put their own priorities and their own motivations ahead of relationships with other people. That can mean that sometimes they produce the results they want to produce quickly, but it can also damage relationships. So again, the entire spectrum can have its pluses and its minuses in certain situations. Being aware of our own preferences and those of other people is going to help us get on with them better. In terms of leadership, it's been observed that leaders who score higher in agreeableness are quite often what they call transformational leaders. They work with people, they understand people. And if we go back to our Eisenhower quote earlier on, they motivate people by understanding what motivates them. Whereas leaders with lower agreeableness, they might be more what we sometimes call transactional in their leadership style. It might be more about using their authority, more of which we'll talk about later, or it might be that it's more about offering reciprocal arrangements. So we're back to reciprocity again. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. How can you use agreeableness in your world? Again, I think it's about understanding people. You might have someone in your team who is high in agreeableness, and therefore you motivate them by including them, understanding their need for harmony and consensus. You might have someone who scores more low on this score, in which case you're probably going to need to perhaps point out the benefits to them of working harmoniously with other people. The last of the big 5 personality traits is neuroticism. And people who score high on neuroticism are more likely to express negative emotions. They're probably more susceptible to things like anxiety, depression, and anger. High neuroticism might mean that people respond to pressure by experiencing quite a lot of stress. People who are high in neuroticism tend to be more pessimistic. What might be considered by some people a small frustration to them can be a very stressful pain. People with lower neuroticism, there can be some benefits to that. They can be calm. they'll respond to changes and pressure more calmly and won't be as emotionally unstable as people with high neuroticism. But of course, if you have someone who is very low in neuroticism, they might find it difficult to understand someone who's more higher in neuroticism. And this is, again, when you're working with people, I think where that key emotional intelligence skill of empathy comes into play. If you're someone who's very calm and placid and takes things in your stride, being able to empathize with someone who is much less emotionally stable and more reactive is a real challenge. But as with all of these aspects that I'm talking about, the real key is getting to know people, getting to understand people, and appreciating that we're all different. I often think of the big 5 personality traits as something like a graphic equalizer on an old stereo. We're all on these 5 traits, and some of us may be lower in one and higher in the other. The combinations of those 5 traits are not infinite, but huge. And so therefore, when we're dealing with different people, they're all going to look and feel and behave differently. And so getting to know people and understanding them is going to be key to how we relate with them effectively. So lastly, I want to look at the work of Professor Robert Cialdini. Cialdini is the Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Arizona University. He's also lectured at Stanford and California University. He's a member of the US Academy of Sciences, and he was actually an advisor to the 2012 presidential campaign of Barack Obama. His book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, was written after he spent 3 years doing undercover research in organizations where influence played a big part, sales organizations with leaders, etc. And he distilled his learning down to 6 principles of influence, which he says play a key part in the psychology of persuasion. The book sold over 3 million copies, been translated into 30 languages, and is listed as one of the 50 great books on psychology in a book of that title. Cialdini's work has been quite influential on an organization some of you may have heard of, the Behavioral Insights team. The Behavioral Insights team, or as it's sometimes called the Nudge Unit, was created by the Cabinet Office and is now a private organization partially owned by the Cabinet Office, but also owned by some private organizations. As you can see, they say their vision is a future where people and communities can thrive in a world shaped by a deep understanding of human behavior. And they work globally, advising governments and businesses how to use an understanding of psychology in order to influence people's choices and behavior. They've been discussed in the media this year because actually their work has also advised the government in how to communicate to and manage people's behavior during the pandemic. So Cialdini has 6 principles of influence, and I'm going to take us through them one by one. The first one is reciprocity, which is a word that took me quite a while to get my tongue around. It's quite tricky to say sometimes. Reciprocity is all about the deep human need to give back when we feel we've been given something. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Examples of this in our everyday life, in offices, for example, when someone gets the tea round in, we quite often feel we should do the tea round the next time. Or the great tradition of the round of drinks in the pub. Can also work negatively, of course. If we feel we are not getting back from somebody we've given to, they will go down in our estimation. Reciprocity is used in the hospitality industry quite a lot. An example of that is when you go to a cafe or a restaurant and you get your bill at the end of the meal. The bill will quite often have 2 mints or 2 jelly beans in it. And we know that if you get a bill with some jelly beans or a mince in it, we actually on average will give a bigger tip. Another example is mail shots. Charities will send mail shots out asking for donations. If they include a free ballpoint pen in that mail shot, their average response rate and level of donation is higher. It's important to emphasize that this is not a conscious decision. We don't get a mail shot and think, oh, how kind they are, they've given us a pen, I must give them more money. But subconsciously, the feeling of reciprocity feels that we need to give back. How can you use reciprocity positively in your everyday interactions with people? I would say by showing interest in them, by helping them with their tasks, their goals, their ambitions, by understanding what they need and by showing that you care about what they need, you're likely to get back what you've given. As the old saying goes, what goes around comes around. Cialdini's second principle is commitment and consistency. What he means by that is that human beings have a deep need to stick to their promises. Most of us, if we say we're going to do something, we want to deliver on that. Good example of commitment and consistency working is Weight Watchers. If ever you've been to a Weight Watchers meeting, you'll know that every week you weigh yourself and then you give a commitment as to how much weight you'll lose over the next week. The other thing you're doing is you're publicly making a commitment and you're giving it to a number of people. We know that the more people you give a commitment to, the more likely you are to stick to it, which is why, for example, things like sponsored marathons generally work, because somebody gives a promise that they will do something, they give it to a lot of people. The other thing that influences sticking to commitments is getting a written commitment. If we tend to write something down, we tend to stick to it. How can you use commitment and consistency in your everyday world? If you're asking someone to do something, getting them to commit to it means they're more likely to do it. Just simply getting a yes, I will is more likely to get someone to do that. If you can get a written commitment, you're more likely to make that commitment firmer. If I asked someone to do something by the 12th of July, I'd probably ask them, will you get that done by the 12th of July? I might ask for their commitment to let me know if it's not going to happen. These principles can work together as well. If we tie together reciprocity with commitment and consistency, I could, for example, say, if you get this done by the 12th of July, I will do X, Y, Z, whatever it is that you want me to do. Is that okay? And get a commitment from someone. Cialdini's third principle is social proof. Social proof is basically the idea that most of us, most human beings, are influenced by what other people do and by what percentage or what numbers of other people do something. I told you, for example, that Cialdini's book had sold 3 million copies and had been translated into 30 languages. That's an indication of social proof. It indicates that his product, his thoughts, his ideas have been read by and viewed and embraced by many people. If I said his book had only come out last week and had only been read by 3 or 4 people, you'd find the book less credible. Social proof was actually used by the behavioural insights team to advise HMRC. HMRC had a problem with people not getting their tax returns back on time. The behavioural insights team advised them to put a simple message into their communication that 90% of people returned their tax returns on time. Just putting that simple message in their communication improved the rate of return of tax returns quite significantly. Most of us like to do what other people do. Another example is in hotels. Hotels over recent years have tried to reduce their laundry bill as well as improving the impact on the environment by not washing so many towels. And some of you may have seen now in hotels signs that say, if you do want your towel washed, leave it on the floor. But if you're happy to use it again for another day, just hang it over the rail. And then it will say 90% of customers are happy to use the same towel. And that reduces their costs and it saves energy, thus having a positive impact on the environment. How is social proof relevant to you in your relationships with other people? Well, our reputation is very much about social proof. And if good stories spread around us throughout our team, throughout our organization, people are more likely to be influenced by us and want to work with us and want to communicate with us effectively. Equally, it can work the other way, of course, and social proof can damage the reputation of organizations or people. Social proof, of course, is incredibly important nowadays in the world of internet, where TripAdvisor, other websites will have reviews on there. And one of the psychological biases we need to be aware of is the negativity bias. Human beings are actually more likely to give bad reviews than good reviews. People are more likely to spread bad news than good news. And so in terms of your interactions with people, constantly trying to keep your behavior and your interaction with them positive is pretty key. The fourth principle is authority. Many psychological experiments have demonstrated the power of authority on human beings. It's quite deep-seated in us to look up to people in authority, to respond to them, to follow their orders or their instructions. For example, you're probably more likely to vacate an office if your boss or managing director came into the office and asked you to do so, than if a colleague on the same level did so. If you're walking on the street and you're stopped by a police officer, you're probably more likely to tell them where you're going if they ask than you would be a member of the general public. Of course, like all of these principles, this can be used for good or bad purposes, and history is littered with examples where good people perhaps did some unethical or immoral things simply because they felt that they were ordered to do so. But authority doesn't just mean rank or being a boss. It can also mean things like expertise, your credentials, your qualifications, your experience. So, for example, I told you that Robert Cialdini was a lecturer at both Stanford and California. And I told you that his book was listed in a book that listed the 50 best books on psychology. That gives his work some credibility and some authority. Authority can also be bestowed upon you by other people with authority. If you were giving a presentation, for example, and you get the boss or an expert in the field you're talking about to introduce you, that will lend you some authority to your audience. That's why I told you that Professor Cialdini had advised the Obama campaign. We need to be careful with that, of course, though, because what if some of you are not particularly fans of President Obama? It may well be that by associating Cialdini with him, that diminishes his authority in your eyes. And so again, I emphasize really good influencers understand their audience and understand what their audience's motivations, opinions, points of view are. You can also influence how you're seen in terms of authority by how you communicate with people, your body language, your tone of voice, your pace. People who have authority and are confident are quite often comfortable with silence. And if you look at some of the great communicators, they will take pauses when they're communicating, and they won't necessarily rush what they're saying. So let's look at the fifth principle. That's liking. It's perhaps the easiest to understand and sometimes the hardest to influence in ourselves. People are more likely to do things for people they like. People are probably more likely to respond positively to the opinions and the viewpoints of people that they like. They're probably more likely to believe people they like. But what is it that we find likable in people, or indeed dislikable? It's influenced by so many things, and quite a few of you are probably quite familiar with the ideas of biases and prejudices. There are some things that we may simply not be able to control in how other people perceive us. But there are definitely some things we can do to influence whether people are like us or not. For example, giving people our time, and we'll come back to that later on, makes people like us. Listening to them makes people like us in general. There are some body language things. In general, depends on our cultures sometimes, but in general, people like eye contact. Going back to emotional intelligence, having social skills and being able to self-regulate appropriately will make us more likable. Whereas if I don't pick up on somebody's maybe unconscious cues they're giving us, and I don't moderate my behavior appropriately, that's probably going to negatively influence my likability. Using people's names tends to make us likable. Remembering people's names does as well, and remembering details or information that they've given us in previous interactions. Equally, the reverse of all of those things can negatively affect our likability. Now, I've used a smiley face there for a very important reason. A big chunk of the human brain is devoted to recognizing faces and reading facial expression. We see faces everywhere, even when they aren't there. This is why people see faces in clouds or the man on the moon, etc. It's so powerful, in fact, that try this. Next time you're walking past a shop that sells clocks or watches, have a look in the window. The timepieces in there will, on average, usually be set to a particular time. And that time's 10 to 10 or 10 past 2. And that's been done for years and years and years in that trade. One theory is that because that time resembles a human face with a smile, it puts customers subconsciously in a slightly better mood and makes them more likely to buy things. Isn't psychology fascinating? It's interesting, isn't it, that during the period of the pandemic, many of us have been wearing masks for long periods of time, even when we're interacting with other human beings. And I think that's an interesting facet of human communication, because fewer of us have seen other people's smiles. It's more difficult to read people's facial expression and their intentions when we're wearing masks. So how can you use liking in your world? I guess some of those things I've spoken about before. Showing interest in people, giving them your time, showing them you consider their feelings, adapting your behavior to their preference. So Cialdini's last principle is scarcity. Human beings evolved to find things that are rare or scarce attractive. It's why gold and diamonds are of such value. It's why limited edition prints sell more than prints which there's an unending production line of. It's why at the beginning of the first lockdown, there was a lot of stuff in the news about things like loo roll and pasta and flour being bought in bulk because people were worried that these would become scarce commodities. So if human beings find scarcity attractive, what is it that we can do to use that principle in our lives? It may well be that you have a scarce expertise or a particular knowledge or skill that is not that abundant within your organization or within your team or with the people you're dealing with. That will make your influence more attractive to people. But there's one commodity that we all have that is scarce, and that's our time. Particularly if you're a leader, but in general, if you're a colleague or a friend, relative, giving people your time will be positively influential on them. So I've barely scratched the surface, really, of human psychology and Robert Cialdini's 6 principles. I personally think they're fascinating, and I've certainly learned a lot since my exposure to these ideas. But I guess the underlying thing here is that if we're going to effectively communicate with and influence the people we encounter, understanding them, understanding ourselves, and tailoring our approach to them is going to make us way more influential and persuasive. So I'm going to leave you with one last quote, which is from Stephen R. Covey, who wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Covey said, "Seek first to understand, then to be understood." So I'd like to thank you for giving me your scarce time and wish you very happy influencing. Thank you very much.